Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. This is the inaugural Closing the Research to Practice Gap Retreat, hopefully the first of many more to come. I'm really excited to welcome you. The team at Advanced RI-CTR, Bridge, and Providence Boston CFAR are really excited to have you all here today. I think we're expecting a few more people to trickle in over the next little bit, but we're gonna go ahead and get started. So, as an introduction, my name is Ruben Martinez. I am an assistant professor in psychiatry, the training director of Bridge, which is our implementation science program here at Brown, and the lead of implementation for Advanced RI-CTR. We are all here today because we are interested in closing the research to practice gap. This is a pervasive gap between what we know to be effective, evidence-based treatments, evidence-informed treatments, practices, programs, and what's actually done in the community. Our goals today are directly related to how we can go about doing that. So I really believe that when we put these goals together, we were thinking about what are the ways that we need to band together, to group together, to develop networks and communities to close this research to practice gap, to have the best, most impactful impact, the most important impact on the health and well-being of our communities. And those goals are, we want to increase and improve clinical and translational research in Rhode Island and beyond, build capacity for real-world implementation research, practical applied implementation work, and develop collaborative research networks within Rhode Island and across Southern New England, and eventually even further. But we got to start small because we want to build to something. So how are we going to do that? So today, I'm going to be talking not for very long. Then we're going to have an incredible panel come up and discuss lessons from research that seek to close the research to practice gap. I'm really excited. We have incredible panelists from 4 very different sectors who are going to share with us their insights, facilitated by Dr. Hannah Frank. We'll have a quick break, and then we will have 4 breakout sessions. So these all, you selected these when you registered. Our first breakout session, and they are, as Hilda is reminding me, on the room number for your breakout session is on your name tag. This is a nice little touch here. So you are going to this room, 270 for me, for your breakout session. So everyone should have that. If you don't, if you're part of Advanced CTR, Advanced RI-CTR, can you just raise your hand or stand up really quickly? Okay, so go to one of these people and they will help get you sorted. Thank you, Hilda, for reminding me. So in session 1, we have an incredible community engagement panel led by Drs. Allison Tovad and Lauren Bohlen. In session 2, I'll be leading a panel or a work breakout on applying insights from implementation science to health and mental health care practices, so really applied implementation. Session 3 is going to be co-led by Drs. Ronnie Elwey and Margaret Crane on making research actionable to policymakers. And finally, we have an awesome breakout led by Drs. Carly Goldstein and Tricia Arnold for strategies to share your implementation science and research beyond academia. We'll have a lunch networking. As you may have seen out there already, there are tables that have little signage on them where you can network and build some new collaborations. And then our own incredible Dr. Ronnie Elwey will be giving us a keynote, and then we'll have some moments for reflections and a farewell. All right. This will become relevant. Seems a little random right now. How many of you have been to a rock climbing gym or outside climbing at some point in your lives? Okay, a good number of you. All right. So I've spent I'm an avid climber. I've climbed for like 13 years now. So it's part of, I think, how I feel I am. And this is me climbing in the Red River Gorge in Kentucky. And this is my best friend, Ty, who is my belayer. He's been my belayer for 10 years now, more. And so we have a really strong relationship. And in the climbing world, we affectionately refer to this as a belationship because he is my belayer. The belayer is the person who keeps you off the ground, right? They make sure that if anything goes wrong, they're there to catch you, to make sure nothing happens. This relationship between a climber and a belayer requires some very important things: trust, honesty, consistency, and communication. If you don't have those, bad things can happen, right? The community and relationships of climbing are my favorite things about it. It's what makes it so fun, but also makes it fruitful and possible. I really believe that as we seek to strengthen our capacity to close the research to practice gap, we will need to leverage some of those insights, building networks, collaborations that are founded in consistency, honesty, communication, and trust. So we borrowed a little bit of insight from the climbing gym. On the right, this cute little looking for a partner signage here is called a belay board. In most gyms, you have something like this. So you actually sign up and you put your name, your contact info, and the kind of climbing that you want to do. And then people will text or call people off of this board to form new relationships, build new collaborations, new networks. So that is what every one of you has, our own little version of your name to put on our boards out there. So if you notice when you came in, there are some boards out there. And Hilda's gonna hold this up, this very nicely designed belay card, if you will, for building new collaborations. And one of the focuses of this retreat is building collaborations, building networks, and building that community of trust. So what we'd like for you to do is, even if you're curious about a new project, a new collaboration, we have people from over 10 organizations and representing a lot of different disciplines here. If you're curious about it, or if you're looking for new collaborations, fill out your card, pin it up in the lobby. We already have some up there right now, and we really, really want to encourage you all to do this. We have a break and we have a networking lunch. While that's happening, pin yours up and peruse. Look around. See if there's anyone who might be interested in something that you're also interested in starting. And then at the end, what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a database of all the different interests, so you can search it and see if there's anyone in the future that you wanna work with. So please, please consider doing this. This is an important part of our retreat to try and build these networks and collaborations. Okay, so without further ado, we are gonna get started, but first, this is the first of two. I'm gonna say thank you to everyone who was involved in making this happen, because this was a huge effort, and I would really like it if anyone who was involved in planning this in any way, shape, or form, Amy, Trisha, Hilda, anyone in CTR, if you could stand up and if we could give these people a round of applause for doing some incredible work in making this happen. Thank you, thank you. Steve, yep. All right, Carrie, yeah. This was a huge effort, and we really appreciate you all being here, and we have put a lot into this, so we hope that it's worthwhile, and we hope again that you will join us next year when we do this again. So we are gonna move on to our panel. So I'm gonna ask the panelists to come up here. Dr. Hannah Frank is gonna be facilitating, and we have some absolutely incredible speakers: Justin Berk, Nate Schwartz, Lauren Bohlen, and Jen Freeman. So panelists, and each one of you has a mic here, and then Hannah, you have the handheld.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see so many familiar faces and many faces I've only seen on Zoom before. I was saying to many of you, I was like, wow, I get to meet people in 3D that I've only seen on Zoom. Okay, so I am really excited to bring this group of amazing panelists together today. And each of them works in a different system where we consistently observe a research practice gap. And so part of what's really exciting is you'll get to hear some of the differences in different systems and then some of the similarities that apply, which is relevant to us in Bridge. A lot of us work with people in a variety of systems, and we do see some of the things that happen in very, very different settings, and then we see some unique considerations. So to kick us off, I'm gonna have each panelist introduce themselves. I'm gonna have you, of course, share your name and your role, but also just tell us a little bit about the system that you typically work in. And then just like a quick overview of your research topics and interests. We're gonna get into a lot more detail, obviously. So again, for the panelists, your name, your system you work in, and a quick overview of your research and interests. Lauren, let's have you kick it off. We'll just go down the line.
Is this working? It is. Okay, so I'm Lauren Bohlen. I'm an assistant professor in behavioral and social sciences in the School of Public Health. I work in community-based settings, and my research is on physical activity promotion, mostly for adults, and in with using digital technologies, but also in community-based settings.
Thanks, Lauren. Justin Berk.
Justin Berk. I'm an addiction medicine physician at Brown University Health, doing work in jail and prison settings, specifically trying to increase uptake of evidence-based interventions for people struggling with opioid use disorder or starting hepatitis C treatments in very low barrier ways, but basically working in jails and prisons.
Thank you.
Nate Schwartz. I am the Director of Applied Research at the Annenberg Institute here at Brown, and work in education in schools. And I think I'm excited about this because I think we make a lot of surface level comparisons when we're thinking about the education research practice gap to other fields and don't do a very good job getting below the surface and thinking about some of the differences and similarities. But the work that I do is I think a lot about teaching and teachers, and so we have a partnership around teacher professional learning and professional development, and then also work in a variety of ways, including here with the Bridge program on student mental health.
Hi, everyone. Is this on?
Yes.
I hate microphones. I'm Jen Freeman. I am the director of the Pediatric Anxiety Research Center, which is at Bradley Hospital, and is a combined clinical and research center that I hope I get to talk about more. I am a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior. I've been in the system for quite a long time, and my area of research is really thinking about how to bring evidence-based practice for pediatric anxiety, particularly exposure-based treatments, how to implement them in hospital settings, including the one in which I work, as well as in community health settings, and really that's the gap that we are trying to bridge all the time. So super excited to be here.
Amazing. Thank you all. So I am lucky enough to get to collaborate with all of these people and have learned so much from all of them. So I'm hoping they can share some of those lessons with you all today. So as we've talked about, you all work in different settings and systems. From your perspective, what do you think is the most common reason that evidence fails to make it from, research study or from the literature into your practice or setting? And we do not have to keep going in order. Anyone can jump in.
I mean, I will sort of jump in with two things. I think one, in my world, which is a world driven by kids and caregivers and families, I don't think we always, and this includes myself, really stop and ask those kids and caregivers and families what they need and what they want this to look like. We might know the treatment that we think works and have data to show from some setting that treatment works, but in applying it, have we actually done that step again and thought to ask? So that's one piece, and then thinking about the sustainability piece from day one, from before pre-day one. If we don't do that, I think we struggle, and that includes payment models as well as sort of provider burden issues.
Yes, and you previewed a question I'm going to ask later, so I'm going to ask more about sustainability and specifically ask Jen to tell us more about the payment model question. So let's remember to come back to that. Thank you. Amazing thoughts. Other thoughts about why evidence fails to make it into practice?
I can go. I think, so mine is a little bit topically focused in that the work that I do is not clinical. And so there's not a natural home outside of the research setting. And that's one of the major barriers. And it's not unique to physical activity, but it is one I see in physical activity research where you're in this position where you either have to think about medicalizing physical activity and making it part of a clinical treatment plan, or thinking about fitting it into an already complex workflow for people in community health settings or other community settings where they're already tasked with a lot of stuff and limited funding. And so you're saying, add this other thing that we've designed where we're only focused on this thing. And so thinking about how you can match the interests of the thing that you're trying to promote. I'm using a lot of the thing and the, what's the other implementation? The thing and the... The stuff. Thank you. You know which paper I was talking about. And so I think that's one of the barriers. The other thing that someone buzz me when I say think next time. The other issue that comes up with technology-based work is that I think researchers tend to think that because it's scalable by design on a technology platform, that it will then scale once you've tested it. And we don't have degrees in marketing. We don't sit in digital health companies. And there's a whole lot of work that goes on between developing a product and commercializing that product. And so just assuming that because an intervention works in a research setting does not necessarily make it scalable outside of the research setting. So I think those are the two barriers I face a lot.
Awesome. Thank you. Excellent points. Nate or Justin?
I'll jump in. So a lot of education, as you know, is not delivered as sort of interventions or programs. It's part of just the general school day. And so I've been thinking about the ways that this, even the name of what we're doing here, we were talking about translational research. And one of the stories I tell, I spent a long time working in the Tennessee Department of Education. And when I first started working there, one of the first questions that I was asked by the commissioner at the time was Tennessee was trying to build a program to keep effective teachers in the classroom and wanted to give retention bonuses to those teachers. And he asked me the question about how should we design this program? I know there's been a lot of research in this area. And I was relatively fresh out of grad school. I also knew there had been a lot of research in this area. I had read most of the research in the area. And I sat there and I looked at him and sat there silently and sort of felt like an idiot. Like I had no idea how to design this program, and I was trying to figure out why it was. And the answer that we often give in education, the problem that we often talk about is researchers like to use academic jargon and they write about effect sizes and all these things that policymakers can't read. And I was sitting there and I could read all these things. I understood an effect size. I wasn't worried about the jargon. I had read each study. But the work of looking at 8 different studies that had been done in 8 different states about different programs that didn't really match up with each other in meaningful ways, and figuring out how do you synthesize these together to create something that builds on this foundation but meaningfully takes our context into account, just felt like a really hard problem, and kind of a problem that was different than just how do you translate a single study into something that other policymakers could understand. It was actually this question about how do you synthesize it, how do you make meaning and build off an evidence-aligned foundation, but do something that is specific to a context. And I know that is what everyone here does with their implementation science, but I think that's a really hard problem, and that's the problem that we don't take on very well in education.
I love that point. Thank you. Go ahead, Justin.
The organizational mission of a prison tends not to be uptake of high quality healthcare, cutting edge research. And I have found that to be one of the bigger challenges. I think broadly, it is like a very clear issue that I imagine relates to any setting of understanding the needs, desires, and goals of a community partner and stakeholder. And if you see the Department of Corrections as a community partner, trying to understand what are the things that they value, how can I communicate that? How can I find ways where there is kind of some shared interest in exploring these types of positive benefits, again, whether it's treating people with opioid use disorder or helping people cure their hepatitis C or whatever other evidence-based intervention is not in practice. I'd say the second, which is more, I think, internally focused, perhaps in academia or even research, is often individuals who experience incarceration or exposure to the criminal legal system face a lot of stigma from the community, but also from healthcare providers, everyone. And so the idea of getting super excited about, how can we better care for someone who, yes, was found guilty of a crime, becomes something that there's not a lot of energy and support for, especially in kind of a policy realm where you have conflicting priorities, and to argue that, as I argue, people who are incarcerated very much have value and should be part of the table, that often does, I think, fall to the wayside because in any marginalized population, those people do not always come to the forefront of conversations. And I think those are the two biggest things working in jails and prisons that come up.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that important point. And all of these. So I think one of the things that I'm hearing too is that figuring out how to align the evidence with the context in which you're working and the populations that you're working and the realities, right, of the settings. And so related to that, one of the questions we have is thinking about adaptations that you make to do this. And of course, there's always that tension between how do you like maintain fidelity to the intervention or ensure that people are getting the treatment or the thing that you're intending to deliver, and making sure that it's designed appropriately for the setting or the population and takes into account their needs that you all mentioned. And so I'm curious if you can talk about what kinds of adaptations you've made to interventions in your setting, how you decide what can be adapted and what needs to remain, or like how far from the original intervention can you stretch? So yeah, take it away. Any order. We don't have to go in any particular order, but I'll call on someone. Justin looks ready.
I'm happy.
Go,
I can give a
please.
quick example.
You just made a great point. Build on it.
One of the research studies we're doing is implementing a evidence-based intervention called MinMon, which is minimal monitoring for hepatitis C treatment. Hepatitis C is a chronic illness that can now be cured in 2 to 3 months very easily. And this MinMon model has been evidence-based intervention in the community, basically saying rather than let's follow these people closely, let's check their labs every 4 weeks, let's just give them 3 months of medicines, send them out, cross our fingers and see what happens. And it turns out it works really, really well. One of our projects is trying to implement this in a jail setting where there's a large number of people that have hepatitis C that often don't have touch points in the community to receive these medicines. And so we're throwing all the medicines at them and saying, you know, God bless, and hoping that everything works out well. One of the major challenges is for people in a jail setting. They may go to court one day from jail. A judge may say, you are free to go. And they don't bring their Hep C meds with them to court. That would be a nice adaptation that we explored and is not possible. And so what that means is that an individual is now no longer incarcerated, is sitting in a courtroom, and as a researcher, our expectation is run back to jail and grab your meds, obviously. Like, that's not going to be their first priority. And so we have tried to explore how can we help facilitate making sure these people do leave without their meds so that they're not risking drug resistance. And so some of those adaptations have been partnerships with a community health worker, a person who has lived experience that can build rapport, doing very intense locator sheets before they get out, so we know not just their contact information, but their mother's contact information, their partner's contact information, where they hang out, which are all these adaptations beyond minimal monitoring, in that we're not just kind of sending them out with our fingers crossed, but trying to provide supports for these individuals who are often without stable housing, and trying to find ways that we can still do this concept of give them all their medicines and then see how they do.
I'm involved in this project, I will say, which is so as a disclaimer. And I will add a follow-up question to that, which is, when do you think, Justin, that it is not minimal monitoring anymore, right? Like, I think you're still in that realm, but is there a threshold for you where you start to wonder, is this really minimal now, or are we just monitoring them closely?
No, I think that's right. And I think the idea is we're adapting it into a jail setting where, rather than traditional Hep C treatment before minimal monitoring was having someone come back into a clinic every 4 weeks, doing blood work, the idea of having a low barrier or a low threshold to start treatment remains kind of a core essential part of the intervention. And it is nice in that, adapting to this new setting, and again, whether that's, I think, in a hospital or education, the ideas of what are those adaptations that we need to make this feasible in a jail and prison setting does require more intervention, like more monitoring, but just in a very different way than what you could do in a community with someone who has transportation and all these other facilitators.
Awesome.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
I'm curious. So, one of the we are thinking a lot in my education world about what we call kind of design principles around these interventions. So how do you figure out not just that there is a purchasable program, which again is not the way education tends to work, that has a single intervention, but how do you, knowing that schools and districts are often designing their own programs based on hopefully evidence-based principles, what are those principles and what needs to stay fixed and what can switch? And so hearing you describe this, the MinMon system with these design principles, and then it sounds like you're building in adaptations. I'm curious about how you evaluate those adaptations and whether you're trying to do this in sort of deep causal ways each time you make a new adaptation, or whether this is more something that you just follow as you go.
I think it's a great question, something that we, not to say struggle with, but think about and try to be very thoughtful of. And I will say are extremely grateful for our wonderful implementation science expertise that we have to help us think through this. One of the ideas is that this is a pilot, which is very fun. And I feel like often people think of pilots as it's just less money, but you're still trying to do it, but you can't say that you're powering it and like you're trying to make up like, well, if there's a huge effect size, we'll figure something out. But I think we have taken the concept of a pilot very liberally in saying we're still figuring things out, so we're going to make some changes, and it might not be as scientifically rigorous as a full clinical trial, but it is meant to be understanding what these adaptations are. And so I'll be honest in that, surprisingly, the community health worker intervention, which I was very optimistic of thinking we're going to have a dedicated person day of tracking these people down, pulling them to the lab, is going to be what does it. That has not been successful. Partnering with methadone clinics has actually been very successful, which we learned later on. And I think as part of the pilot, these are things that we're kind of exploring, and there's some anecdotal evidence. We'll be able to see like how many people did the community health worker bring to the lab for test of cure, how many got it through the methadone. And I think in those ways, we're having evaluation metrics to understand what was kind of the more effective adaptation. And the idea would then be like, okay, we're going to design a package now for kind of a more full-scaled study. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it is kind of a fun part of doing the pilot of like trying to explore what seems to be working and evaluating that to see what seems to be working and what doesn't.
Right. And I think, again, the beauty of the pilot is that it gives you the range within that adaptable periphery to figure out, what are the parts that work and what are the parts. And then maybe in the future, I love that you said causal, because I would love to assess, the causal pathways of these things. But yeah, I think agreed. It's the opportunity to figure out what's pragmatic, what fits with the setting. So go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit sort of about the arc of adapting exposure in our context. This is a place where my age is helpful. So when I came to Brown, I came as a resident, but when I started my fellowship, I was very lucky to be involved in a number of clinical trials that were really at that time. We won't talk about what year it was, but the first, big clinical trials testing exposure-based treatments for pediatric OCD, the pediatric OCD treatment studies, and there were many of them over the those early years. And that was my introduction to what does exposure look like in the most tightly controlled way, with many inclusion and exclusion criteria and sort of all the things that we know are not really practical in an implementation context. And so as we got to the end of those studies, there were a number of things that we saw. There were a lot of kids that did really well in these treatments and in an outpatient research setting. And there were a lot of kids who did not do well, who were really severe, who had a lot of comorbidity, who had a lot of barriers getting to our center, which was actually blocks from here in the Coro building, even though it was, on a bus line and in Providence. And so we started really thinking about how do we take this treatment and include more kids and have more kids have access to it. And so at that point, the federal funding landscape was also changing in a way that's different than now, but where big clinical trials, importantly, were not kind of the only thing in town. And so we kind of branched in two directions at that point. We grew a partial program, the beginning of a partial program that is now much bigger many years later, that allowed us to have a place to implement this treatment for kids that weren't fitting into those non-traditional trials. Hannah may have been there at the time that we were growing that partial program, and takes us back many years, and it really did. It changed who could be included in this treatment. What diagnosis could you have, including kids on the autism spectrum, again, including kids with really, really severe illness that needed treatment more than once a week, and in fact, hours a day, and really started pushing us to think about how do you take exposure into places where kids and families need it most, which is not in our offices. It's, really this idea of treating anxiety where it lives, taking exposure-based treatment out into the world, into the community, into people's houses, schools, Burger King, wherever we need to go. And that was a really powerful moment for us as a team to see the difference in sort of doing treatment in our setting versus doing treatment in someone's own setting. And that led us to a model of home visiting as part of our partial program that has since become really my entire line of work, which is training teams and team-based treatment, including non-licensed providers, to do this work outside of hospital settings, and now most recently in partnership with community health settings. And so the two kind of core adaptations that I think about when I imagine, like, what were we doing in those clinical trials where our treatments were still not the most manual-based, but more manual-based than they are now for certain. We have done a lot of thinking about what is the core part of treatment, and I could talk much longer about all the different ways I have evolved over time thinking about what the core is, but it's that fidelity monitoring piece, like quality. How do we maintain quality? How do we measure quality, but in pragmatic ways? And so a lot of our work, and this is all of my colleagues who are not sitting here, for the last 10 years, we've focused a lot on training and quality. And how do you take sort of just the most key pieces and then have that be accessible to all the different members of a team of all different license statuses and all different backgrounds and all different experience levels to kind of bring that. So without, like, the training and quality piece has become the core of how we bring these treatments out into the world.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I think also naming that what adaptation can look like, as you've touched, Justin and Jen has touched on, is, adapting the delivery model, adapting the frequency of contact, adapting, there are these different pieces. So I'm curious, Lauren and Nate, for you to weigh in on your experience.
Yeah, I think about adaptation in two different ways that comes up. One is thinking about, like, the rigorous ways that we develop clinical trials. One thing that we often will do is we'll develop programs for one-on-one or individual delivery, because from an evaluation perspective, there's less noise. And so it's easier to get it past a grant review panel, because that's the other unsaid thing here, is that you have to get all this work funded when you don't have group dynamics getting in the way, so to speak. But then when you go to implement something one-on-one, that's way more expensive. It's not realistic in terms of the amount of time that it takes, in addition to the extra personnel costs. And so then you're back facing this question of, how do group dynamics come into play? And one of the interesting things has been, group dynamics are one of the strong things in community-based settings, where they deliver community-based programs in groups, not only because it's more cost-effective, but because it builds rich social ties. And so then how can you adapt your program that showed strong efficacy in a one-on-one setting for a group setting? And maybe that's going to be the thing that carries it through, but also maybe it's going to take the program in a different direction. And how can you monitor fidelity when you've changed this other piece of the program? The other thing I think about is adaptation in terms of what we value the intervention or the treatment achieving. And so I think as researchers, we care about one or two outcomes that are related to health, maybe, and that might not be the thing in the implementation context that is highly valued. And so in physical activity, one thing that people often value that they think is weight loss. Weight loss is the one thing that is highly valued. And most physical activity interventions are not going to achieve weight loss. And so the adaptation I have to make is physical activity can do a lot of things, but it can't do the thing that you're saying that you care about in order to bring physical activity into your context. So let's have a conversation about some other things that you maybe value in this context that we can evaluate in terms of how is physical activity potentially important and potentially impactful, and we can measure that to show that it's improving things in your community beyond this one topic, because that isn't, with it there not being a natural home as well for this treatment. It's sort of like, what are the things that we can agree upon that this is important? Is it building social ties? Is it improving mood? Is it getting people to show up here, or just adding a piece to a program that exists where people are saying there's this one module, but I had more questions and I wanted more time on this topic.
I love that point about outcomes. I hadn't even been thinking about adapting to thinking about outcomes in this context, and it's a really excellent point. Nate, do you have additions for us on this?
I'm thinking about that point too. So one of the problems that we often face, which I think is similar to what you're describing, is that the organizations that work with schools, that work in schools, that work with students often have a whole host of goals that they're aiming for the populations, and the data that we can collect as researchers often feels very narrow compared with the things that they care about. And actually, we work with organizations, again, that support teachers, that support schools, that support students, that really feel like they are data-based and are gathering a fair amount of data. And so they survey students and they survey teachers and they do classroom walkthroughs and teacher observations. But the way that works across school systems, across districts, across professional learning organizations that come into schools is enormously different. And so all of them have different surveys that they give. And they all have different ways of running their walkthroughs and doing their teacher observations. And so creating the kinds of networked communities that we want to create around implementation become very difficult, or it becomes difficult for people to speak in the same language about these outcomes beyond something like test scores that turn out to be slow to move and really hard to move and take a long time to measure. And so we've been really working on the practical measurement side and have started thinking about this in terms of measurement toolkits. So one of the projects that we've been doing around teacher professional learning has been to bring together a group of organizations that all work on this in different states and different districts and different schools, but all sort of have relatively similar theories of action, and to get them to line up their theories of action, think about what constructs they all see as important, and bring them together with researchers to think about what could we do in terms of valid measurement for these outcomes, that think about things like student experience and think about things like whether teachers are engaged in their professional learning and feeling like they have agency themselves. And we've now created these toolkits that people can sort of build into the other measurement work and the other data collection that they're already doing, but in small ways. So it's sort of a low lift beyond the data collection that is already happening, but they can do enough of it that everyone suddenly is speaking the same language, and that these networked communities work in a very different way. And so that is not exactly the same as adaptation, but I think it's getting us to the point of everyone being able to talk about adaptations in meaningful ways because they're all looking at the same information.
Yeah, I think that point about speaking the same language is such an important one, and in fact is a really central part of adaptation, because I think also often as researchers we come in with, specific language, as you've alluded to, and I think everyone comes in sort of not just with their language, but also with their agendas, and so aligning those so that you can adapt, in alignment is a critical piece.
And it turns out that bringing the valid measurement instruments is part of it.
Yes.
But actually building the consensus around everyone wanting to use these same valid measurement instruments turns out to be the harder piece, and the piece that we've realized that if we dedicate the time and the space up to it up front, makes a bigger difference to where everyone ends up than even exactly what our survey question is.
Exactly. And I think that's, one of the findings in the implementation science literature around how spending more time in pre-implementation predicts more successful implementation. I think that's such a nice example of it, because a lot of time people want to jump straight to the implementation because it's not necessarily as exciting to spend time talking about measures necessarily as doing the thing. And doing that pre-implementation work can really, really help us. I think I'm remembering, Ruben, when we were in Tennessee and we had a partner, or we were talking with a community partner who was saying that they had an agency who their motto was, what was it? It was, I'm going to mess it up. It was ready,
Oh, ready.
ready, fire, aim was the organization's motto. And she was like, I'm really trying to work with them to say, let's switch to ready, aim, fire. Because the ready, fire, aim was meaning they were jumping right ahead before there was consensus and thought, so I think with adaptation, it's a chance to do your aiming first before firing. Okay, one more question from me, and then we'll have a little bit of time to turn over to the audience. So I want to come back to sustainability, which Jen had mentioned earlier, and thinking about, especially if you do put in this time in the front end, and you think about your adaptations, you think about your context, you think about your partners. What are the kinds of things that you've learned about what it takes to sustain this change beyond what we've already talked about over time? And maybe, Jen, if you want to, I'd love if you talk about the payer piece. That doesn't have to be the only thing, but I think you have particular knowledge of what that can look like as a strategy.
Certainly. I think it takes time. All of this takes time, which I think is really the challenge. I think, Ruben, in your introduction, I was thinking about this in terms of partnerships. Partnerships, real, true partnerships, take a lot of time to build and to nurture and to build that trust. And so we work with a number of different engagement partners and have for many, many years, but thinking about the payer piece in particular, that was new to me when I first started doing this work, especially PCORI-funded work, thinking about how to build a sustainability piece from day one. And so it really is, it's that piece about doing this from, to your point, Hannah, before, the pre-implementation is when we need to start thinking about what is this going to look like on the back end. And so we did start working with payers early on, and I will admit that I was pretty squeamish about it. I was like, oh, we're going to work with payers like that? Like, they don't get to decide what I do and what, people need. And that was short-sighted on my part, and I'm glad I don't know, that I didn't listen to myself because like that ultimately, at least in my world, in the work that we do in trying to develop new service models that will actually match families' needs. If we can't get them paid for, they're not going to help anybody. And so we started early on saying to a partner at Blue Cross, who we continue to work with today, and that was almost how long ago? A long time ago. 12 years ago, what would you need to see in order to cover this? What outcomes, so that we have our outcomes, we were talking about things to measure. Like, I know what I'm used to measuring in an anxiety or OCD study. What do you need to see? And it wasn't the same things. It wasn't, OCD symptoms and anxiety symptoms that they wanted to see. And that was helpful. And so we could start from that, moment thinking about what do we need to show. That is only, a drop of what we needed to do to kind of continue thinking about what does contracting look like. I'm looking at Ronnie and excited for later. What are the policy implications of changing a contract and coming up with a new code, and who gets to decide that? And but starting that process way before you might need it has become really important to us. And that is the most challenging thing that I think that I am facing in our research at the moment, is sort of how do we take these things, no matter how carefully we ask all of our partners what they want this to look like, if we can't get someone to pay for it in all settings, and how that looks different in different settings. My hospital setting version of paying for, in my case, a team-based service model to deliver evidence-based exposure looks really different than what it looks like in my community health partner settings. And within the community health partner settings, the way that's going to get paid for in a CCBHC is different than how it's going to get paid for in an FQHC. And that matters if we want to keep doing this work. So I'm happy to talk about it more outside of this group.
I know maybe people will have it on their belay card. What's the official name of the card? Networking card. Yeah, I think also one of the things you're touching on with sustainability that I'm curious to hear from others about is the breadth of partners that you need to ensure sustainability, right? So do others want to weigh in on this?
I'm thinking about the infrastructure you need to keep things going over time. And there was one study that I'm forgetting the details of, but basically it was testing. There had been a whole bunch of randomized control trials run of various different interventions, and many of them had been successful. And the question was, 5-10 years later, in the places where they'd run these strong trials, were they still doing them? Had this thing that was successful kept up? And I think in this study they actually asked researchers to make predictions about which ones would have kept up and which ones wouldn't have. And the researchers talked about champions and talked about turnover and all the things that seemed important. But actually that turned out to be less predictive of whether or not the intervention stuck around than whether the intervention required sort of new infrastructure beyond what already existed in the school system. And so, like, if the intervention was a letter that you sent home to parents, let's say, or something like that, if the school was already sending letters home to parents and you just needed to change the language, they kept sending the letter. But if you actually needed to print new letters at a different time, no one kept doing the letter. And it was sort of this very, very simple study, but made me think a lot about the ways that we can actually build up kind of the processes, the infrastructure, the systems that make this stuff easy and practical for the people actually doing the work. And I think that turns out not to be exactly the question that we ask a lot of the times as researchers. I think we think about champions and teams and who's in the system and whether or not they care, but there's so much on people's plates that caring is often not enough to keep this stuff going over a long time.
Yeah.
I'm just so glad you said that. That is, I want to echo that. Like workflow, we talked about payment, but like workflows.
Word for it, right.
If someone has to do a new thing that's not part of their regular day-to-day, in a busy real life practice setting, taking care of really high acuity kids or families or, whatever it might be, it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen for long. I'm looking at part of my team and our 2 postdocs who are doing this work every day in community health settings. It's just it's not fair to ask someone to change workflow, and even when there is like organizational value and desire to do it, when we add lots of new things, they don't keep happening. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think of how we can integrate behavioral economics principles into these, right? Like, and this came up in a study I'm involved with that has to do with sepsis bundles in emergency departments. And they just kept saying again and again, we need to make the right thing to do the easy thing, or it's not going to happen. And that, those kind of principles, I think, can really help. Oh, yeah, water delivery for everyone. Thank you. I love it. I know, I did forget to bring my water up, so it's lovely that you. I'm good, but I know. Okay, Justin and Lauren.
Sure. I am trying to think of how to make the sustainability anecdote I have inspiring, and I don't know that I can. Rhode Island was the first state to implement medications for opioid use disorder in a prison setting, offering life-saving buprenorphine and methadone to anyone struggling with opioid use disorder. And in the prison world, we're kind of a big deal. And that if you go to like a criminal justice conference and say you're from Rhode Island, people will run up to you and they know 2 things about Rhode Island. One is, oh, you have a great medication for opioid use disorder program in prison. Would love to learn more. And I've heard that Taylor Swift has a beach house. Have you seen it? Yeah, so those are the 2 Rhode Island claims to fame at criminal justice conferences. And it was indeed an enormous success and has been very sustainable. It started in 2016 and is still kind of a paragon for other states who have not yet implemented this very clearly life-saving intervention that has robust evidence and evaluation of reducing overdose, improving facility culture, doing all these wonderful various outcomes, reducing HIV and Hep C. And I think the reason it has been so sustainable is almost unfortunate in that the opioid overdose crisis was affecting Rhode Island. The governor at the time, Gina Raimondo, identified this crisis. She created an overdose task force, which is still in existence, and brought in expertise. The recommendation was people who use drugs tend to wind up going into jails and prisons because, as many of you know, drugs are illegal. And so if we're trying to have like a high impact target intervention, this is a population that makes a lot of sense. And then put it in the governor's budget. This was not a Senate bill. This was not a referendum vote. It was put in the governor's budget that we're going to pay for this and do this. And so I don't know if there's like an Eric intervention that is like the governor rams something down a state agency's throat, but that's what happens. I think if there was more pre-implementation time, there would probably be more buy-in from some of the facilities. But that's really why it worked. And I wish it was like this grassroots advocacy component with there's, some component of that. But truthfully, it was top-down policy that everyone was ultimately kind of forced to accept. And that's how it worked. And so I think it sets up Dr. Elwey's presentation this afternoon of how affecting health policy, I think, sometimes can be a really beneficial way to make sure something is sustainable so that if there are additional workflows and infrastructures, it's almost mandated and just going to be the new norm. That's the Rhode Island success story for sustainability.
I think that was very inspiring. Thank you.
I'm regretting going last because I don't think I'm going to end on an inspiring note. Because I
It's
don't.
not a requirement. Justin
Okay.
just said, I don't know how to make this inspiring, and I think he did. So
I don't know that I have any insights into making something sustainable. I think it's something that I'm trying to approach with curiosity. So the other week, we, with partners that I work with in the health equity zones with the Department of Health, we were talking about some really great programs that the different health equity zones have implemented where they've had amazing community buy-in, the community has really loved them, and then they lose funding. Or the governor says, we're interested in funding this other thing. And so they completely shift focus. And then the community's calling them up saying, when are you going to run that thing again that we really, really liked? And they don't have an answer for them because the program can't exist anymore because they don't have funding for it anymore because the priorities have shifted. And that's even within the health equity zones where there is a really great infrastructure to do a lot of community needs-based work. And I think it is such an interesting question in terms of who are the different partners that you need to have at the table in terms of policy, in terms of contractors, and like how much of this can really be volunteer versus how much can we think of some sort of payment stream so that this isn't just a constantly grant funded workflow, because in the health equity zones, they keep applying for funding. So the students that I'm working with right now in the MPH program are looking at what the health equity zones are doing and developing different interventions to support their needs. And one of the things that two of the student groups have come up with is trying to figure out how to help them get more funding. And the reality is they're spending already so much of their time trying to get lots and lots of funding. And you can, as we all know, put in lots and lots of funding applications and still not have any funding. And so it's a question I'm approaching again with a lot of curiosity and thinking about who are the people that need to be at the table to be asking these questions together to think about how we can support important health promotion programs.
thank you. I have a follow-up quick question for you, and then I want to give a couple minutes for audience questions. I think what's interesting about the health equity zones is that although funding, of course, is a major barrier to sustainability, there is something that is very well sustained in terms of the infrastructure and some of the like workflow pieces. And can you talk a little more about what parts of the health equity zones you feel like are sort of are really well sustained even with the juggle and challenge for funding?
So their infrastructure for community needs assessment is really well sustained. As I think there's also the backbone agency component where it's not its own entity. It's like a fabric of entities, and where there's a strong community agency who's running things and will have ties in the community even if the health equity zones aren't there. And I think that was one of the beauties of how they designed the health equity zones was they built it into what was already there and kind of thinking about workflow rather than trying to create something new. They tried to build with rather than build anew.
Thank you. All right, we are almost at time, but we can maybe take one or two questions from the audience. I'd love to hear what you all are wondering about from our fabulous panelists.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel, and just, yeah, really appreciate the insights on this topic. This question or comment is inspired by a webinar I watched last week. So Sandro Galea, who's the Dean of WashU School of Public Health, brought together, and I think they had a 2-day convening, but they aired a panel at the end on rethinking how evidence is generated. And really thinking about better ways of knowing. And there were really some interesting questions, and the panelists, and I think it's online if anybody's interested. And so I guess in hearing some of what you're saying, it kind of brought to mind, again, what we think as evidence, and do we really need to be thinking about should we be asking different questions? And so I guess kind of putting that back to you, any thoughts on that, and what would we need to do to kind of move in that direction? Any thoughts?
Thank you.
I mean, I think that is an incredibly important comment / question. And I think about that a lot in terms of our work, and, clinical trials work in general is based on, that evidence is based on a really, really limited subset of participants. And that's a problem. That's a problem if we're using that and calling that the evidence that we're trying to bring out into the world. And so that's something that we've thought a lot about in our group in terms of, who has been included, what youth and families have been included in our work, and how can we expand that. And I don't know that we're doing this in the right way. Our current trials are very purposefully and intentionally trying to be much more inclusive and gathering new evidence about, about new models that are both implementation and evidence generating at the same time. But you're right.
I'll just say, I think you're bringing up, I think there are two separate issues here, which are both important ones in education. One is this question of representativeness and who's part of the studies that we're running. And so there's a lot of evidence, for example, that most of the randomized controlled trials and most of the causal evidence that we have in education comes from large urban school systems. And that is a problem if you aren't always working in large urban school systems. But then the second issue is, what are we actually doing trials of, and are we asking the right questions? And I think a lot of our grant funding systems and a lot of our federal research dollars that go into education are all built on sort of the idea that researchers will just submit the right grant proposals. And so one of the things that we don't do very well is sort of figure out, what do we already know, and what are the questions that we could add on top of this that would unlock something, that would allow us to do better at this thing that practitioners, that policymakers are really struggling with. And so we are trying, we run this thing at Annenberg called the Ed Exchange, which is sort of a set of, we have working papers, we have synthesis papers, and then we have a measurement repository as well. And we're trying to build a piece of this that actually brings in people to set learning agendas in a different way, and works with school and district leaders, and works with teachers, and works across the system to try to think about not just kind of what are the big topical areas, which is the way the Institute for Education Sciences works, is that when they put out calls for grants, they basically say you can submit a grant in this topic area or this topic area, but there aren't the types of questions that I think you need that are generated by the community saying, here is the actual practical problem that we're facing that we need information on, and we think we can do that differently.
Can I just add one comment, just because there's people in this room? One thing I think that came up, which was really interesting in that panel, is what's rewarded in our institutions and universities. And getting one more paper on your CV. And again, so that was just an interesting piece as well to think of this is just I encourage us all in the room to really think about, again, what's getting rewarded, tenure, all these things where it's like, that's not, right? Some of what you're saying, some of it does not get rewarded. And so how do we kind of push in another direction? And I know that's a very, that's a lot.
It's a relevant point, though. I appreciate you making it because I think all of this work, and especially like community engaged work, this is often a consideration. So, okay, let's have you two maybe comment, and then we'll wrap up so we get on a break. If either of you, Lauren. Nothing else. You do also.
I saw a hand signal. So
No, we have time for one more.
Oh, we do. Okay,
It's
great.
10:15.
Oh, I thought we only had till 10. So. Amazing. We have extra time. Then no rush. Speak as long as you would like on this topic.
I'll say two quick things. One to the recent point that I think very much does impact anyone doing work in marginalized communities. I think I try to be hyper aware and introspective about the concept of being a careerist in producing work for people who are marginalized, in that ensuring that my career is not being advanced at the expense of individuals who are incarcerated, or making sure that the work is meant to be moving the needle forward and not just for self-promotion. So I appreciate that point, because I think it's something that, especially as you get further along in the career, you have to be constantly reminded. The other point I was going to briefly make was about what is evidence. And I think education is a good example that is just so overwhelming to me, of the multifactorial things that go into a child's education or academic performance, that it's very overwhelming. And what are the questions? In prison, interestingly, I would say we have all this robust evidence of what saves lives and helps people and makes you not die, and it's not being done in prisons, and it's like this very clear implementation gap. And I think in that sense, in that sphere specifically, maybe in contrast to others, some of the evidence, yes, we should be asking, but really it is like, how do we implement this? And I think this is why implementation science in prison make for such good belay partners, is because there is this gap in the knowledge that we do know and actually making it happen among a specific population.
Great point.
I think a question we can ask is, what can we learn from the evidence that's already there, and why do we need to keep generating new evidence? I think, and like, how can we think about adapting the evidence that exists to answer some of the research questions, and then go forward with partners to say, what's the evidence you need to collect for whatever the metrics you need to have for funding or performance reviews or what have you, that might also meet the needs of research? Because I do think constantly collecting new clinical trial data and generating all of this expensive information that's on a limited set of subsampled people may not necessarily be serving a larger population. And so can we get creative with all of the data that's out there and probably stored somewhere expensively on some sort of cloud that we can analyze and make meaning out of to draw insights from and hopefully move the needle forward?
All right, I think we actually are at time. Sorry if anyone had a question you were dying to ask. Luckily, we have this amazing networking board, networking cards at lunch, and so you can look for your panelists and ask them questions. I just want to give a huge, huge thank you. I just admire all of you and all the work that you're doing, and let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you all so much.